In 1892, a scholar in Europe sat down with a manuscript nobody outside a small circle of specialists had ever properly read. Not a fragment, not a few damaged pages, a full book, 10 heavens, a complete cosmology, an entire theology of creation nobody in the Western Church had known existed. And it had been sitting there the whole time, copied generation after generation by monks in Slavic monasteries, Bulgaria, Serbia, Russia, untranslated, unknown outside those walls. For roughly 1,000 years, an entire branch of Christianity was quietly preserving a book that the rest of Christianity had simply never heard of. Tonight, we go find it. I need to be careful with you from the very first sentence, because this book shares a name with one we've already touched on this channel, and confusing the two would do you a real disservice. This is not the Book of Enoch, not the one with the Watchers, the fallen angels, the giants born of them. That book, scholars call it First Enoch or Ethiopic Enoch, because its only complete surviving text comes down to us in the ancient language of Ethiopia. This is a different book, a separate work, written by a different author, at a different time, describing a different journey. Scholars call it Second Enoch, or Slavonic Enoch, or in its own oldest title, the Book of the Secrets of Enoch. Same man, same starting point in Genesis, a completely different vision. I want to give you a quick, plain way to keep the two straight, because you're going to want it later when you're talking about this with someone else. First Enoch is the one with the 200 watchers descending onto Mount Hermon, taking human wives, fathering giants, teaching forbidden crafts to humanity, and being bound in darkness to await judgment. The version quoted directly in the New Testament book of Jude, the version that survives complete only in ancient Ethiopic. Second Enoch is the one we're opening tonight. 10 heavens, a throne room, a creation account reaching back before Genesis itself begins. A man transformed into something like an angel. Different content, different original language, different manuscript history entirely. The only thing they share, really, is the 2 verses in Genesis 5 that both of them are trying to fill in. I want to tell you why I went looking for this one. I'd already spent an evening months ago deep inside First Enoch for an earlier episode, and somewhere in my research, I found a footnote, a brief, almost apologetic mention that there was another Enoch text. A second one, preserved only in a language I'd never studied, discovered by Western scholarship so recently that my own grandmother could have been alive when it first reached print in English. I remember feeling something close to vertigo. How many more of these are there? How many more books did some corner of the ancient or medieval Christian world treasure, while the rest of us never even knew to ask? I want to name, too, why I think this particular gap matters more than an ordinary trivia footnote. Most of the books we've studied on this channel were lost to time, or lost to controversy, in ways that at least happened within a shared, connected Christian conversation. Rome, Alexandria, Palestine, all talking to each other, arguing with each other, deciding things together, however imperfectly. This book's disappearance from Western awareness happened along an entirely different fault line, the slow historical drifting apart of Eastern and Western Christianity itself, the split that would eventually harden into the Great Schism of 1054, dividing the Orthodox East from the Catholic West for the better part of 1,000 years. A book like this one, sitting inside Slavic Orthodox monastic life, was on the far side of a divide that had almost nothing to do with theology and almost everything to do with politics, geography, and centuries of 2 halves of Christendom slowly stopping talking to each other. Tonight, I'm handing you one of them. This is the story of Second Enoch. Let's start where every Enoch story starts, in your own Bible. Genesis chapter 5. A long, quiet genealogy, name after name, birth after birth, death after death. And then, in verse 24, something breaks the pattern. Here it is in the King James, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's it. That's the whole account. No death recorded. No burial. Just a man who walked with God so closely that one day he simply wasn't there anymore. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 5 picks the thread back up centuries later. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God. 2 verses. That's the entire canonical record of Enoch's life. 2 verses and a hole where his death should be. I think you can understand now why ancient readers couldn't leave that hole alone. Every genealogy entry around Enoch in Genesis 5 follows the exact same formula. So-and-so lived so many years and begat a son, and lived so many years more, and had other sons and daughters, and died. Adam died. Seth died. Enos died. Kenan died. Every single name in that chapter, one after another, ends the same flat, final way. And then Enoch's entry breaks the pattern entirely, refusing even to use the word death at all. Ancient readers, reading that chapter the way we're reading it tonight, would have felt that break the same way you'd notice a single missing beat in an otherwise steady drumline. Something is different here, and the text itself seems to know it and refuses to explain further. Second Enoch picks up exactly there. Enoch, we're told, is 60 years old. 2 men appear to him. The text describes them as huge, their faces shining like the sun, their eyes like burning lamps, fire coming from their lips. They tell him not to be afraid. They tell him the eternal God has sent them to take him up for that day into heaven. And then Enoch does something I think is worth sitting with before we go any further. He doesn't ask what heaven looks like. He doesn't ask about angels or thrones or secrets. He calls his sons together, Methuselah among them, the very man whose long life becomes a kind of biblical shorthand for old age, and he spends his last hours on earth giving them instruction, caring for his household, making sure the people he loved were provided for before he let the 2 shining men carry him away. I want to pause on that, because I think it tells you something about the whole spirit of this book before we've even left the ground. Whatever cosmic wonders are coming, this text keeps circling back to ordinary faithfulness. A father making sure his sons are cared for before he goes anywhere at all. Now, before we go up with him, I need to give you the honest, complicated history of how this book survived, because it's genuinely different from anything we've covered before on this channel, and I think the difference matters. Most scholars believe Second Enoch was originally written in Greek, likely by a Jewish author living in Alexandria, Egypt, sometime in the 1st century, quite possibly before the year 70. That date matters. The text describes practices connected to the Jerusalem temple as though they're still happening, still current, not yet destroyed. If that dating holds, this book was written while the temple your Bible describes was still standing, by someone living in one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient Jewish world. And then, for reasons we don't fully understand, the Greek original simply vanished. Every single copy. Gone. What survived instead is a translation into Old Church Slavonic, the liturgical language of medieval Slavic Christianity, the language of monasteries in Bulgaria, in Serbia, eventually in Russia. Someone, centuries after the original Greek was written, translated this book into Slavonic. And in that language, and only in that language, it kept being copied. Monk after monk, monastery after monastery, century after century. I want you to sit with how strange that is. A book written by a Greek-speaking Jew in Egypt in the 1st century survives only because Slavic Christian monks 1,000 miles and many centuries removed from its origin thought it was worth the labor of copying by hand, generation after generation, long after the language it was first written in had lost every single copy of its own. Western Christianity, the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking church that gave us most of the theological arguments we've discussed on this channel, had no access to this book at all. Not because anyone rejected it, not because any council debated it and voted it out, because it simply wasn't there. It existed in a linguistic world Western scholarship hadn't yet opened. That changed in 880, when a Russian scholar named Nikolai Tikhonravov published the Slavonic text for the first time in a form other scholars could study. And it changed again for English readers in 1896, when R.H. Charles and W.R. Morfill produced the first full English translation. Read that again, 1896. This book had been read, treasured, and copied inside Slavic monasteries for something like 1,000 years before most English-speaking Christians ever had the chance to read a single sentence of it. Every other book on this channel so far faded from a starting point of wide, shared knowledge. Jasher, quoted right there in your Bible, known to everyone, then lost. Hermas, bound into the same manuscript as your Gospels, read for centuries, then quietly set aside. The Apocalypse of Peter, read aloud in church on Good Friday for 300 years until it wasn't. This one never had that wide starting point to fall from, in the West at least. It simply lived somewhere else the whole time. Preserved, loved, copied with real devotion. Just never in the room most of Christian history has been standing in. I think that reframes the whole question this channel keeps asking, honestly. It's not always, how did the church let this go? Sometimes the question is, how much did the church never even get the chance to hold? Let's go up now the way Enoch went up. The two shining men take him, and the text describes something startling right away. Enoch says it felt like flying, and he looked down and saw the clouds beneath him, and then he was standing on the first heaven. 10 heavens, not one sky, not a single realm above the clouds. 10 distinct levels, each with its own function, its own inhabitants, its own strange architecture. I'm going to walk you through them, one at a time, the way the text itself does. Slowly, because I think the accumulation is part of the point. The first heaven holds what the text calls storehouses, vast treasuries of snow and ice and dew and oil, guarded by angels who release them onto the earth according to command. Enoch sees the angels who govern the stars, the ones who keep the order of the seasons moving the way they're supposed to move. I want to pause here and be honest with you about what kind of imagination this is. This isn't Genesis. Genesis tells you God separated the waters, made the lights and the firmament, and moves on. This book wants to know the machinery behind that. Who's actually holding the snow until it's time to release it? Who's minding the store? Enoch's two angelic guides don't just show him the storehouses. They explain the reasoning behind the design. Snow and ice, he's told, are held apart deliberately at God's own command so that the earth doesn't drown all at once, and so that the seasons keep their proper order rather than collapsing into each other. It's a small detail, but I think it matters because it tells you this book isn't just cataloging wonders for their own sake. It's insisting, at every level of the ascent, that the universe is held together by intention. Nothing in this heaven happens accidentally. Even the weather is a decision. There's a real appetite in this book for that kind of administrative detail about heaven, and I think it comes from a very human impulse, one I recognize in myself. When something in your life feels chaotic or arbitrary or cruel, there's a comfort in imagining that somewhere, someone is actually in charge of the specifics. Not just a vague cosmic order, but an actual angel with an actual storehouse, releasing an actual measured portion of snow at an actual appointed time. I don't think that comfort makes the image literally true. But I understand, more than I used to, why a persecuted, uncertain first-century community might have wanted to picture heaven that specifically administered, that carefully staffed, against a world that so often felt like it was running on nothing at all. I think of my own worst nights that way, honestly. The nights where nothing in my life felt held by anyone at all, where every hard thing seemed to be simply happening arbitrarily to no particular purpose. I don't know that this book's storehouses and named angels are literally true in the way it describes them, but I know that on those nights, some version of that same comfort, the idea that somewhere, something in the machinery of my life was actually being tended, actually being minded by someone who hadn't forgotten it existed, was the only thing that ever got me through until morning. I want to say a word about Paul here, because your own Bible actually gives us a strange, brief parallel to exactly this kind of journey. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 has Paul describing a man, almost certainly himself, speaking carefully in the third person, who was caught up to the third heaven, into paradise, and heard words unlawful for a man to utter. Paul stops there. Third heaven. He doesn't tell us what's above it, doesn't number any further levels, doesn't describe the architecture in any detail at all. I think it's worth noticing that restraint on Paul's part, especially once you see how far Second Enoch is willing to go past it. Where Paul gives us a single guarded sentence about the third heaven and refuses to elaborate, this book takes you all the way to the 10th, cataloging every level along the way. I don't think that makes Paul's account more true and this book's account less true, necessarily. But I think it tells you something real about restraint as its own kind of honesty, that the apostle who was actually, canonically, caught up into paradise chose to tell us almost nothing about what he saw there, while this later, uncanonical text is willing to tell us everything. The second heaven is darker. Literally. The text describes it as a place of darkness, and here Enoch sees prisoners, angels in chains, guarded, awaiting judgment, weeping. The text doesn't give us their full story here the way First Enoch does with its long account of the Watchers descending to earth. It simply shows us the aftermath. Punishment already underway. Enoch is warned not to intercede for them, not yet, and moves on, troubled. The third heaven is where the book, I think, becomes genuinely unforgettable, and I want to take real time with it. Enoch is led into a garden. Paradise itself, the text says plainly, the same word your own Bible uses for Eden. Every tree is in flower. The fragrance is overwhelming. 4 rivers flow through it, one carrying honey, one milk, one oil, one wine, echoing and expanding the 4 rivers of Eden in Genesis 2, though this book gives them a different, richer character than the plain water Genesis describes. And at the center, there is a tree, the text says, indescribable for pleasantness and fine fragrance, the tree of life itself, spreading over the whole garden like the sun, prepared for the righteous at the final judgment. 300 angels, the text says, keep and tend the garden, singing without ceasing. That's beautiful. That's genuinely beautiful. And if the vision stopped there, this would be a simple, comforting book. But it doesn't stop there. Because in the very same heaven, not a separate realm, not a different level entirely, but the very same third heaven, the text turns Enoch northward and shows him something else. Darkness. No light at all. Fire that burns without illuminating, the text says, a strange, cold-hearted flame. Angels of punishment, terrible in appearance, with instruments of torment in their hands. Ice. Frost. Cruel angels overseeing it. I want to be honest with you about why I think this detail matters more than it might seem to at first. Every other ancient vision we've studied keeps heaven and hell in separate compartments, separate destinations, separate journeys, the way the Apocalypse of Peter shows them as 2 distinct places entirely. This book puts them side by side in the very same heaven, divided only by direction, north instead of south. A wall's width almost between paradise and punishment. I don't know exactly what the ancient author meant by that choice, but I know what it does to a reader, sitting with it honestly. It refuses to let you imagine mercy and judgment as separate worlds, comfortably distant from each other. It puts them in the same room. And I think that's a harder, truer thing to sit with than 2 entirely separate destinations ever could be. I think about my own life in those terms sometimes, if I'm honest with you. There have been seasons where genuine goodness and genuine failure sat far closer together in me than I was comfortable admitting. Not 2 separate rooms of my life, one bright and one dark, but the same room, the same week, sometimes the same day, holding both at once. I used to think spiritual maturity meant getting all the darkness fully separated out, fully exiled to its own distant heaven, so the bright room could finally stay clean. I'm not sure that's actually how any of us work. I think this strange detail in an obscure, half-forgotten book is closer to something true about the human condition than a lot of tidier, more comfortable pictures of heaven and hell as far-apart destinations ever managed to be. Paradise and punishment, north and south of the very same heaven. Closer to how a real life actually feels from the inside than we usually like to admit out loud. There's a manuscript wrinkle worth knowing here too, because it shapes how much confidence we should place in any single detail I'm giving you tonight. Second Enoch survives in two significantly different manuscript families, which scholars simply call the longer recension and the shorter recension. The longer version includes far more of this elaborate architectural detail. The storehouses, the named angels, the extended description of paradise and its dark twin. The shorter version is far more compressed, missing whole sections the longer version treats at length, and scholars still genuinely disagree about which version sits closer to the original first-century text, and which one accumulated extra material over the centuries of Slavonic copying. I'm walking you through the fuller, longer version tonight because I think it gives you the richest sense of what this book was reaching for. But I want you to know, honestly, that even within its own manuscript tradition, this book doesn't come to us as one single, settled shape. The fourth heaven turns from moral architecture to something closer to ancient astronomy. Enoch is shown the courses of the sun and the moon, their chariots, the precise mechanics of how they cross the sky. And then something genuinely strange, creatures called phoenixes and chachakadri, described as having the bodies of lions and the tails of crocodiles, faces like something between a serpent and a lion, 12 wings covered in something like the colors of the rainbow, singing at sunrise to greet the sun's rising. I want to be plain with you. Nobody knows exactly what to make of these creatures. Some scholars think they represent solar guardian spirits drawn loosely from wider ancient Near Eastern and Hellenistic imagery about the sun's journey. This is tradition doing something Genesis never does, populating the mechanics of the sky with singing, winged guardians, part of an elaborate ancient solar calendar theology this book takes very seriously. The text goes further still, giving Enoch a detailed count of the sun's chariot, the size of it, the number of angels who draw it across the sky, the 4 crowns it wears through the different seasons, a level of astronomical bookkeeping that tells you this author, or the community he belonged to, cared deeply about the calendar, about knowing exactly which days were sacred and when. Some scholars connect that concern to the same broader stream of Jewish thought that produced the calendar disputes we know, shaped groups like the community at Qumran, who kept the Dead Sea Scrolls. Arguments about whether Israel's sacred calendar should follow the moon or the sun, arguments serious enough to split communities apart. This book, with its phoenixes and chakadri singing the sun up every morning, may be a window into exactly that kind of anxious, careful attention to getting the sacred calendar right. The fifth heaven brings us back to the Watchers, though this book calls them the Grigori, a Greek-derived word essentially meaning the ones who watch. Enoch finds them here in a strange, suspended state, not fully judged, not fully free, standing in ranks, silent, and the text says their faces were withered, and their silence continual, and Enoch says he was troubled at the sight of them, and they wept when they saw him. Their leader here is given a name, Satanael. I want to slow down on that name because it matters historically. This is one of the earliest surviving texts where a figure recognizably related to what later Christian tradition calls Satan appears with something close to that exact name, cast specifically as the leader of a rebellious host of angels who set themselves against God's order. You are watching, in this obscure, barely known Slavonic text, an early stage in the development of an idea that would eventually shape Christian theology for 2,000 years. Elsewhere in the book's longer manuscript tradition, we're actually told something about why Satanael fell in the first place. And I think it's worth hearing, because it's a different explanation than the ones you may already be familiar with. It wasn't lust, the way some traditions frame the Watcher's fall in First Enoch, drawn down by desire for human women. Here, the fall is framed as pride. Satanael, the text says, conceived the impossible thought of setting his throne higher than the clouds above the earth. wanting to be equal in rank to God's own power. It's a simpler, starker motive than desire. Just ambition, reaching for a rank that was never his to claim. I think that's worth noticing because it means this obscure text preserves one of the earliest full articulations of what would later become the dominant Christian explanation for Satan's fall. Not lust, but pride, wanting to be higher than he was made to be. The sixth heaven is calmer. Archangels here, the text says, oversee the harmony of the created order, the changing of the seasons, the courses of the years, the coordination of all the lesser angels beneath them. There's a description of constant hymn singing, joy that never grows tired, order that never breaks down. Enoch names 7 of these archangels specifically, giving each one a distinct area of responsibility. Angels over the seasons, over the rivers, over the fruits of the earth and of the vine, over the souls of men, over the beasts. It's a strikingly bureaucratic vision of heaven, honestly, and I don't say that dismissively. I think it's actually a comfort dressed up as an org chart. Nothing in this book's vision of the sixth heaven is left ownerless, unattended, or forgotten. Every part of creation, down to the fruit on the vine, has someone specifically responsible for its flourishing, answering directly to God. For a community that had likely watched harvests fail, watched rivers run dry, watched suffering that felt random and unattended, I think there's real theological comfort tucked inside that administrative precision. And then the seventh heaven. And here I think you need to slow all the way down with me, because this is the throne room itself. Enoch describes seeing from a distance the Lord seated upon a very high throne. And around that throne, the text piles up description after description, almost as if straining against the limits of what human language can hold. Armies of incorporeal beings, 10 troops of angels, cherubim, seraphim, 6-winged and many-eyed hosts, singing without ceasing. Enoch says he fell on his face, terrified, and the angels leading him had to lift him and reassure him, telling him to be brave, that he would stand before the Lord's face forever. That word forever is doing something important here. This isn't a passing tour. Something is about to change permanently. I think it's worth knowing, too, that this seventh heaven throne room and the elaborate hierarchy of angels surrounding it didn't stay confined to this one obscure book after its own time. Jewish mystical circles in later centuries developed an entire tradition of throne room visions. Scholars call it Merkaba mysticism, or Hekkalot literature. Named for the heavenly palaces these later mystics claimed to ascend through in trance and meditation, counting angelic ranks, naming guardians at every gate, in a style strikingly similar to what Second Enoch is already doing in the 1st century. I'm not going to claim a direct, provable line running from this specific book to those later mystical schools. The history is murkier than that, and honest scholars disagree about exactly how connected these traditions are. But the family resemblance is real and worth knowing. This obscure Slavonic text sits somewhere near the headwaters of an entire current of Jewish mystical thought about ascending through heavenly palaces toward the throne, a current that would keep flowing, largely apart from mainstream Christian awareness, for well over 1,000 years after Enoch's 2 shining visitors first appeared to him. The 8th heaven, called Muzaloth in the text, governs the changing of the seasons through the zodiac. The 9th, called Kuchavim, holds the heavenly mansions of the 12 zodiac signs themselves. I'll be honest with you, these 2 levels are brief in the text, almost transitional, more concerned with ancient astronomical and calendrical theology than with moral vision. But I think even their brevity tells you something. By this point in the ascent, the ordinary architecture of the created world, stars, seasons, calendars, is nearly behind Enoch entirely. He's climbing past the very mechanics of time itself. And then, the 10th heaven, Erevat, the end of the ascent. Here, the text says, Enoch sees the Lord's face directly, as much as a face like that can be seen at all, described as like iron made burning hot in a fire, brought out and sparks shooting from it. Enoch is brought before this presence, and something happens to him that I don't think any of the other books we've studied on this channel have quite matched in its audacity. He is changed. The Archangel Michael, at God's own command, takes Enoch, strips him of his earthly garments, and anoints him with what the text calls delightful oil, shining like the sun's rays, and clothes him instead in garments of God's glory. And the text says plainly in its own words that Enoch looked at himself afterward, and he had become like one of the glorious ones. There was no observable difference left, it says, between Enoch and an angel. I want to be very careful and clear with you here, because this is a genuinely bold theological claim, and I don't want to soften how bold it is just to make it more comfortable. This book is telling you that a human being, righteous, faithful, but still a human being, born the same way you were born, was transformed in the presence of God into something angelic, not symbolically, not as a metaphor for spiritual growth. The text presents it as an actual, described transformation, garments and oil and all. I'll tell you honestly, this is the part of the book I found myself returning to the most while I was preparing tonight's episode, because it touches something I've wrestled with in my own faith for a long time. There's a kind of transformation I actually believe happens, not the literal angelic reclothing this book describes, but something real all the same. I remember a season, years back, of real brokenness, where I genuinely did not recognize the person I saw when I thought honestly about myself. And I remember slowly, over years, not overnight, not in a single dramatic vision, coming to feel like a different man than the one who started that season. Not perfect. Still entirely human, but changed in some way I still find hard to put into plain words. I don't think this book's vivid image of literal angelic transformation is describing something that happens to us the way it describes it happening to Enoch. But I understand now why an ancient author reaching for language to describe what real transformation feels like from the inside might have reached for the most extreme image available to him, a man reclothed, anointed, made new enough that no observable difference remained. Your own Bible doesn't go this far with Enoch, or with anyone, in quite this explicit a way. It tells you Enoch walked with God and was taken. It doesn't describe him being reclothed in angelic garments and rendered indistinguishable from the heavenly hosts. That specific, vivid elaboration is this book's own contribution, its own tradition, and I want you to hold it as exactly that. I want to slow down one more time before we move past this transformation scene, because there's a detail worth naming plainly. The text says Enoch's own face and body were changed enough that when he was later sent back down to earth for those final 30 days, his own son Methuselah and the elders of the people were afraid to come near him until Enoch told them to bring incense and gifts to calm his appearance so he could speak with them face to face without terrifying them. That's a strange, almost tender detail. A father, come home, having to be made approachable again to his own family, because whatever happened to him in that 10th heaven left a mark his loved ones couldn't look directly at without fear. I think there's something honestly recognizable in that image, even stripped of its supernatural framing. Anyone who has come back changed from something enormous, grief, illness, a genuine spiritual turning point, knows a version of that same strange gap, the people who love you needing a little time, a little translation, before they can fully recognize you again. Once transformed, Enoch is given knowledge. Vast knowledge. The text says he's shown the secrets of creation itself, things God says even the angels don't fully know, and he's commanded to write it all down. 30 scribes are given to him, and over the course of what the text describes as many days, Enoch dictates 366 books, the text claims, containing the full secrets of creation, before he's finally sent back down to earth for a brief 30 days to teach his sons everything he learned before being taken up permanently. I want to spend some real time now on what Enoch says he was shown about creation itself, because I think it's the single strangest and most theologically distinctive piece of this whole book. Genesis chapter 1 opens with the earth already existing, formless and void, and God speaking light into being over it. It doesn't describe what existed before that. It doesn't explain where the raw material came from. Second Enoch does something Genesis never attempts. It reaches back before the beginning. The text describes God, before anything existed at all, commanding one of the things that were not to become visible. And out of that command comes a being the text names Adoil, described as exceedingly great, and Adoil bursts open, releasing a great light from within himself. And from that light, the ages of creation begin to unfold. I want to be honest with you about how strange and how genuinely unique this is. There is nothing quite like Adoil anywhere in your Bible. This is the ancient author reaching for language to describe creation out of absolute nothing, a philosophical problem later Jewish and Christian theologians would spend centuries wrestling with under the Latin phrase creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. And this obscure, barely known Slavonic text is attempting an answer to that exact problem in mythic, narrative form, possibly earlier than almost any other surviving Jewish or Christian text attempts it. The text doesn't stop with Adoil either. It goes on to describe a second primordial figure named Arukas, called forth to become the foundation of everything below. The text describes this figure as heavy and very red, and from him comes the solid ground beneath creation, the way Adoil's burst of light became everything above. Two foundational beings, one of light, one of solid weight, called forth from absolute non-existence by God's bare word before Genesis chapter 1 even begins its first sentence. I mention Arukas because I think it shows you this isn't a single, isolated flourish of imagination. The author was working out an entire, structured mythology of the moment before creation, layer by layer, filling a silence Genesis leaves completely untouched. And then, tied to this creation account, comes a second idea, one that traveled much further and had much more influence than the strange figure of Adoil ever did. The text describes all of created history as lasting exactly 7,000 years, 6,000 years of ordinary time, corresponding to the 6 days of creation in Genesis, followed by a 7,000-year age of rest, corresponding to the Sabbath. And after that seventh age, the text says, there will be an eighth age entirely outside of time as we know it, eternal, without measured years at all. I think you may already sense where I'm headed with this, because you've likely heard an echo of this idea somewhere in your own Bible, even if you never knew where it originally came from. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 in the King James tells us, "But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." I want to be careful here, because scholars genuinely debate whether Peter is directly drawing on this specific tradition or simply echoing a broader idea that was already circulating widely in Jewish thought by his time, this book being one witness to it among several. I'm not going to claim certainty where the evidence doesn't allow it, but I think it's worth knowing that this idea, history unfolding across a symbolic 7,000-year week, with the final age standing outside of time altogether, was a real, live current in the Jewish and early Christian imagination, one this obscure Slavonic book preserves for us in unusually full, explicit form. It would go on, in later centuries, to feed directly into entire schools of Christian millennialism, arguments about exactly when history would reach its final Sabbath rest, arguments some believers are still quietly having today. You can trace this same 7,000-year framework showing up in various forms in other early Jewish and Christian writers who almost certainly never read this specific Slavonic book, which tells you the idea itself was circulating more widely than any single text. The Epistle of Barnabas, which we mentioned briefly in our episode on the Shepherd of Hermas, makes essentially the same argument explicitly, reading the 6 days of creation as 6,000 years of world history followed by a Sabbath age. Later rabbinic sources debate similar timelines. What's distinctive about this book isn't that it invented the idea. It's that it gives us one of the fullest, earliest, most narratively developed versions of it we still possess, wrapped inside an actual creation myth featuring Adoil and Arukas, rather than left as a bare mathematical argument the way Barnabas presents it. Before Enoch is finally taken up for the last time, the text gives us his ethical instructions to his sons, and I think a few of them deserve to be heard, because they show you a side of this book that has nothing to do with cosmic architecture at all. He tells them to walk uprightly before the Lord's face. He tells them not to plan evil in their hearts against anyone. He tells them to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, help the injured and the afflicted, and not to turn away from anyone bruised by fortune in their sorrow. He tells them, too, that he himself is only able to give them this instruction because of what he witnessed on his own journey, that he has walked through all 10 heavens now, seen both the storehouses of blessing and the place of punishment, and that everything he's asking of them flows directly out of what he was shown, not out of some abstract moral theory. There's something worth noticing in that structure. The most cosmic, elaborate vision in the entire book ends deliberately in the most ordinary possible place, a father sitting with his children, translating everything he saw into instructions about honesty, generosity, and kindness to animals. The heavens don't stay heavens for very long in this book. They come back down to earth as a checklist for how to actually live. And then there's a commandment that I think is worth its own moment, because it's genuinely rare in ancient literature of this kind. Enoch tells his sons that whoever mistreats the soul of an animal in secret does evil in his own soul. That taking even a young bird from her nest against her will is a wickedness. That people should let every animal breed according to its kind on the earth, and not touch a beast intending harm. I don't think I've encountered anything quite that explicit about animal welfare anywhere else on this channel, or honestly, anywhere else in ancient religious literature I've spent time with. This isn't a modern sensibility being projected backward. It's sitting right here in a document nearly 2,000 years old, coming right after visions of thrones and burning faces and angelic transformation, a plain, direct instruction not to be cruel to a bird's nest. There are other instructions woven through this same section worth hearing. Enoch tells his sons not to take unnecessary oaths, neither by heaven nor by earth nor by any other created thing, because, he says, there is no swearing at all in the world to come, and an oath sworn now should simply be truth enough on its own. He tells them not to accuse falsely, not to slander, not to take bribes that pervert judgment against a righteous man. He tells them specifically to judge with mercy, remembering that they themselves stand in need of mercy. And he tells them not to build their houses through another person's labor gained by unjust means, not to profit off another man's sweat without paying him fairly for it. An instruction that sits remarkably close to warnings you'll find in the actual book of James, in your own New Testament, about wages kept back by fraud, crying out against the one who withheld them. I find something worth sitting with in that juxtaposition, honestly. The same book that shows you the throne of God and the secrets of creation from before time itself also stops, near its very end, to tell you not to steal a fledgling from its mother out of simple cruelty. Whatever else we make of this book's authority, I think that combination says something true about what its author believed mattered, that the grandest cosmic vision and the smallest act of unnecessary cruelty were, in the end, part of the very same moral fabric. So let's come back down to earth with Enoch one last time and ask the question this channel always ends up asking. Why did this book stay buried? And I mean that question differently tonight than I've meant it in any of our other episodes. This wasn't a forgery uncovered and discredited the way the false book of Jasher was. This wasn't a beloved book that slowly, gently lost its place over centuries of careful, prayerful sorting the way Hermas did. This wasn't a book that touched a controversial theological nerve and was quietly set outside the boundary because of it, the way the apocalypse of Peter's vision of mercy for the damned was. This book simply lived somewhere else. For 1,000 years it was read, copied, and treasured faithfully by an entire branch of the Christian family the rest of us mostly never think about, Slavic Orthodox monks, laboring over manuscripts in monasteries most of us couldn't name, keeping a first-century Jewish vision of the 10 heavens alive in their own language for their own community, never intending to hide it from anyone. It simply never crossed the linguistic bridge into the wider Christian world until scholars finally built that bridge by hand in the final years of the 19th century. I think there's something worth sitting with in that, something a little different from the lessons of our earlier episodes. Every other book on this channel has taught us something about how memory fades, or how forgery deceives, or how controversy narrows what a community is willing to hold on to. This book teaches us something gentler, and in its own way more humbling. That treasure doesn't have to be lost to be unknown to you. Sometimes it's simply being kept faithfully, patiently, by people in a room you've never had reason to walk into. Still being copied, still being sung over, still being believed this very hour by someone whose language you don't speak. I think about that a great deal, honestly. Now that I've spent this much time with this book, how much of what I assume is universal Christian knowledge is really just the knowledge of my own small corner of it? How many more Second Enochs are sitting right now in some monastery library, in some language I've never studied, waiting for someone patient enough to finally build the bridge? I think, too, about how differently this book's obscurity reads once you've actually sat inside it for an hour, the way we have tonight. It would be easy to hear unknown in the West until 1896 and assume that means unimportant, marginal, not worth the time. But we've just spent this hour together inside 10 heavens, a creation account reaching back before Genesis itself begins, an early articulation of Satan's fall through pride, a direct ancestor of an entire Jewish mystical tradition, and one of the clearest ancient calls to basic kindness toward animals I've ever encountered in religious literature this old. None of that was unimportant. It was simply unheard by most of us until very recently. I think that distinction between what's unimportant and what's merely unheard is worth carrying with you well past tonight's episode. Enoch's own sons, the text tells us, wept when he was finally taken up for the last time, and built an altar at the place where he last stood among them, and offered sacrifices in his memory. They didn't get to keep him. They got to keep what he'd written down before he left. 36 books, or 366, depending on which manuscript you trust, containing everything he was shown. I want to close this section by telling you what happened to Methuselah specifically, because I think it's a fitting final image before we come back down to our own century. The text tells us Methuselah and the people gathered with him built that altar and then went on with their lives the way people always have to, carrying forward only the written record of what they couldn't keep in person. That's the position every single one of us is actually in with every book we've studied on this channel. We never get the original vision. We only ever get what someone thought was worth writing down afterward, and what someone else, centuries later, thought was worth the labor of copying by hand one more time so it wouldn't disappear on their watch. We don't have those actual books today. We only have this one, secondhand, translated, copied by hands 1,000 years and 1,000 miles removed from wherever the real thing might once have been. And I think that's true, in a smaller way, of nearly every book we've studied together on this channel. We are almost never holding the original. We are holding what someone, somewhere thought was important enough to keep copying, long after they had every reason to simply let it go. If tonight introduced you to a book you had never once heard of, not even a rumor of it, before this evening, comment the word "watched" below. I read every single one. Send this to someone who loves the idea that there might still be more out there to find, more rooms in the house of Christian memory that most of us have simply never walked into. And if you want more of these forgotten and buried scriptures, because there is so much more still buried, in languages most of us will never learn, waiting for someone patient enough to translate it home, subscribe to the Buried Scripture. Keep your Bible close. And keep remembering that the boundary of what's known isn't always the boundary of what's true. Sometimes it's only the boundary of what's been translated yet. Somewhere right now in a monastery or an archive or a family's old attic box of papers nobody's opened in decades, there is very likely something else like this. Waiting. Not lost exactly. Just quiet. Held faithfully by someone who never thought to make noise about it. I don't know what it is. I don't know when we'll find it. But I've come to believe, after everything this channel has walked through together, that the work of digging things back up is never really finished. There's always another door. Quotations from Second Enoch come from the standard English translation of the Old Church Slavonic text, not the King James Version, since this book was never part of that translation and was in fact unknown to English-speaking Christianity until 1896. Scripture quotations are from the King James Version unless I say otherwise. If you read any of this differently than I do, I'd genuinely like